Good design isn't magic, and it isn't random. It's built on principles that anyone can learn, and once you know them, you'll never look at design the same way again. Hello everyone, I'm Sahithi, a high school senior from Maryland in the United States, and the Director of Marketing and Communications at Prisit Design. At Prisit, we are a student-led initiative aimed at providing free and accessible marketing services to anyone who seeks help in building their passion projects or leading organizations. And today, we are going to be breaking down the principles of design, the rules that guide how elements in a piece of art or design work together. These principles are what make a design feel balanced, engaging, and effective. I'm going to be explaining each one and then going over some examples to show you how these elements play out in actual design. Let's get started. The first design principle we're going to be going over is balance, which is about how visual weight is distributed in a design. Symmetrical balance means that a design is mirrored on each side and has very similar elements on each side. In this case, this poster of The Last of Us is symmetrical and therefore balanced because the main character, Ellie, is completely centered, as well as this moth and most of the text down here. Therefore, if I drew a line through the middle of this design and mirrored it, it would look pretty much the same. This can often have a very stable and professional look, but in this case, the symmetrical nature of the design actually has a very dominating effect on the viewer. This is even further emphasized by the fact that the character is staring directly into the viewer's eyes, which has a very unsettling and intense effect on the viewer. This aligns with the fact that the show they're advertising, The Last of Us, is a thriller, so they want to establish that kind of unease in the audience to increase suspense for, when they go and watch the show. But balance doesn't necessarily mean symmetry. There's also asymmetrical balance, which uses different elements but distributes them in a way that still feels visually even. It's just less predictable and more dynamic. In this case, the Spider-Man poster uses asymmetry even though it's still balanced. On this side over here, there's a large half of Spider-Man's face, which isn't on this side. Instead, there's a red half circle, as well as some elements showing Spider-Man and the logo, and some text. In this case, in order to balance the design while maintaining that asymmetry, they use two contrasting colors, which means neither side really stands out more than the other, and they also use more elements that are just smaller on this side, rather than having one big element. So by doing that, even though it's asymmetrical, when you look at the design, it still feels very cohesive and it feels like everything goes in the proper spot. There's not really one side that feels more heavier or like it's getting more attention than the other. Next, we're going to talk about proportion, which is the size relationship between elements in a design. When proportions in a design feel natural, the design feels right. Think about how furniture fits in a room or how features on a face line up. Designers can also play with exaggerated proportions to make a statement, like making one element really big compared to the rest of them, or making it really small. In this case, the designer approached this other Spider-Man poster with a very minimalistic strategy. Rather than having a lot of elements competing here, they only have a couple: this text, Spider-Man here, and some logos in the corner, as well as the city. But this design still makes a very effective use of proportion, though it might be less traditional. Instead of having some elements that you can compare the size with, they use this large open space of the dark sky background compared to the subject, Spider-Man. This dark sky background takes up most of the design, which may make it feel boring in some cases, but not in this one because they use a gradient as well as some texture to make it more visually interesting. Then here in the left corner is Spider-Man with this moon in the background almost haloing his head, which brings the viewer's attention to that point. Spider-Man is a lot proportionally smaller than the black background, which means he is the center of attention. However, even though Spider-Man is proportionally smaller, the design does not feel imbalanced because of in the left corner, in general, like this whole area is much lighter compared to how dark this is, which they counteract each other, as well as the fact that under Spider-Man is this entire city, and up here the title text is there to balance it out. So despite the really exaggerated proportions in this design with the really big strong background and the very small subject, it still feels cohesive and it still feels correct because of the way they used balance and proportion to make the design effective. Now we're going to be talking about contrast, which is what makes certain elements stand out. Contrast often comes from opposites, such as light against dark, one color next to another, big next to small, and textured versus smooth. Without contrast, everything in a design can just blend together, and with contrast, the eye immediately knows where to look first. In this design, if you ignore the middle part, most of it kind of uses a similar color scheme, very neutral with this beige and dark gray. But in the center over here, these hands are a very vivid red color. This brings the viewer's attention immediately to the hands, which are covering this face's eyes. That actually aligns with the message that the designer is trying to convey. I wish I could see the real you. This is something a lot of designers like to do in their work. They try to intentionally bring attention to a certain element in the design that aligns with the message so that the viewer is able to more easily interpret what the designer is trying to convey. Next, emphasis, which is along the same vein of contrast, is about creating a focal point, the spot that you want the viewer to notice first. Designers can use contrast, but also placement, isolation, or color to create emphasis. The key point is that one element needs to stand out while everything else supports it rather than competing for attention. In this case, the designer uses leading lines and color to create the focal point of this subject, this man over here. The spotlight, so literal spotlight on the focal point, creates leading lines, so two lines over here that lead the viewer's eye to see the man, and using this light yellowish color to fill in the spotlight stands out amongst the darker red, so that again the viewer's eyes first go to the spotlight and then see where it leads. Next, we're going to talk about the design principles of repetition and pattern. Repetition is when you use the same elements like a color, shape, or font to create consistency and unity in a design. Pattern is more like a structured kind of repetition where it follows a clear and predictable order. Both repetition and pattern make designs feel intentional and can also reinforce the unity of the design. In this case, the designer repeats the word practice over and over again while cutting off the top part and slowly revealing more and more of the word. Even though it's in varying degrees of being cropped, you can still tell what it's supposed to say because down here it shows what the final result is supposed to be. And overall, that brings attention to the main message, which is the centerpiece and pretty much only focus of this design. The message, practice makes perfect. In this case, the designer is really effective in using repetition because it actually aligns with the message you're trying to convey. The designer repeats the word practice, which is literally the definition of the word practice, to repeat an action over and over again until you become good at it. So by repeating the word practice over and over again and then leading to perfect, they both show you as well as tell you that repetition of an action, practice, makes perfect. Now we're going to talk about rhythm, which is basically repetition that creates a sense of flow. Regular rhythm repeats the same spacing and pattern like tiles on a floor, whereas flowing rhythm creates curves and bends like waves. Progressive rhythm changes gradually, like a pattern that slowly increases in size or color step by step. Overall, though, rhythm keeps a design from feeling static and gives it some more energy or flow. This design is a very strong case of flowing rhythm because of all of these curves that kind of create like spiral-like images over here. The designer also uses some orange to bring attention to the centers of these spirals or curves. But overall, using this gives a lot of visual interest to the design and keeps the viewer engaged as they come to find out what the message of the actual design is. And like the last design I showed you guys, this is also another example of design principles being used intentionally to convey the meaning, because in this case, the main message, as you can see in English, is powerless. The spirals and the curves here kind of remind me a lot of sort of spirals you see when someone's being hypnotized. And if you're in hypnosis, that's a state where you can't really control yourself. Someone else is controlling you. So in essence, you're powerless. So by using that visual element, the reader or the designer makes the viewer feel what they are trying to communicate, which makes the message extremely effective. Now we're going to talk about movement, which is how the viewer's eye travels through a design. A strong composition guides the viewer's eyes naturally, almost like an invisible path. Lines, curves, repetition, and even color placement can all control how the eye moves, whether it's fast and chaotic or slow and calm. In this case, the designer uses color, text, and leading lines to guide the viewer's eye towards the focal point, which is this figure. The edges of the text create imaginary lines that are diagonal and directly lead the viewer's eye towards the top of the figure. Furthermore, the use of this lighter color contrasts with the background of black and red to show the viewer that whatever this text is, as well as what it's leading to, are the most important parts of the design. Lastly, using text as a way to force movement is really effective because in this case, in the West, we read from left to right. So when a Western viewer looks at this and, tilts their head a little to the side so they can read this title text, their eye naturally moves from here, the left side of the text, to the right side, which again guides their eye up towards the focal point of this piece. Now, this is a more direct form of movement, but the earlier example I showed you of this poster also is very effective at promoting movement in the viewer, because the viewer's eyes follow all of these curves and spirals, and in this case, there's not really a particular place that all of those are leading to, but that is, again, reinforcing the message of the designer because it makes the viewer feel like they're in the midst of chaos. Next, unity is when all the elements in a design feel like they belong together. Nothing feels out of place or random. Unity can come from using consistent colors, shapes, or themes so the design feels cohesive. In the example of this poster here, the designer didn't necessarily use the exact same color throughout the entire design. They also use a variety of different font sizes down here. But still, looking at the design, it feels very, very unified. And that's because the designer kept to using a certain color palette of different colors and used it very consistently and intentionally. For example, the designer highlights this image, and this image in pink, whereas these ones in blue. So it's a little like balanced still, even though they're using the different colors because it's alternating. And down here, The designer decided to use the blue for the title text as well as other important information like this QR code and logo, because the blue is darker and therefore stands out more effectively against the white background. Then he uses the lighter pink color to have this text down here, which is just extra information. But overall, this stands out the most, which is why the designer intentionally used the darker blue for that. Last but not least is variety, which is what keeps design interesting, kind of like the inverse of unity, because too much unity can often feel boring or repetitive. But by adding variety through changes in color, shape, texture, or scale, the designer can add life. The trick is to balance variety with unity so it feels intentional rather than chaotic. In this example, there's a lot going on. All of these pieces of text everywhere, all of the bold colors, but the design still feels very unified and, it still feels very pleasing to the eye. This is because all of the variety, all of the choices that the designer made to add variety are extremely intentional and purposeful. For example, the designer uses 3 or 4 different fonts in this one design. This bold sans serif font, script font, an unbolded sans serif font, and then this tall, skinny block font. However, to maintain that unity, the designer makes sure that they're all in the same color and they're used for a specific purpose. For example, these 2 fonts over here are used for the header or the title of the piece, and they're centered and big so that that's what the viewer sees first. This more subtle, unbolded sans serif is used for body text because that's what the viewer would move to later once they want to find out more. And this taller block font is used for the brand or studio name. So again, that sets it apart from the rest. Also, the designer uses variety in a very unique way here, where in order to add some visual interest, rather than just having the image of this woman in the background, in order to add some more of the orange and just make things more interesting, the designer mirrors the cropped eyes and mouth, and also crops out this nose and places it in front so that the viewer's eyes are drawn towards these. This not only makes the design look more interesting, but also aligns with the message that the designer is trying to convey. Again, using the principles of design in a strategic way to further what their message is. Because in this case, the message says, notice everything. And by drawing the viewer's attention to the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the viewer is forced to, notice those features in detail and look at the intricacies of them, thereby following the message of the designer by noticing everything. So those are the core principles of design: balance, proportion, contrast, emphasis, rhythm, repetition and pattern, movement, unity, and variety. What a mouthful. Together, they shape how we see and respond to visual work. But here's the thing. Knowing the rules of design isn't just about following them to the T. Once you understand them, you'll also know how to break them or use them intentionally. That's where design gets really interesting. Thank you. Again, my name is Sahithi, and if you liked this video or if it was helpful to you in any way, which I hope it was, please like and subscribe to Prisit's YouTube channel. If you're interested in our content, you can also check out our Instagram and TikTok channels, where we post more content about design tutorials, just design history, and just other fun things and informational things related to the world of graphic design. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day.